Hollywood may have sold you the dream of the perfect heist with Sinatra's swagger in Ocean's 11, but Britain beat them to it. Long before the Las Vegas Rat Pack dressed crime up in tuxedos, British filmmakers were already laughing their way through elaborate robberies and eccentric plots. These weren't slick operators. They were underdogs, daydreamers, and lovable rogues. So, where did the caper really begin? Let's rewind to the world of bowler hats, tea breaks, and the most unlikely criminal masterminds. The Lavender Hill Mob, 1951. It started with gold, tons of it. The Lavender Hill Mob is the crown jewel of British heist comedies, and it did something remarkable. Instead of celebrating hardened thieves or suave masterminds, it handed the spotlight to a timid bank clerk named Henry Holland, played by Alec Guinness. On the surface, Holland was a man invisible to the world, polite, orderly, and utterly forgettable. The kind of clerk who could spend decades pushing paper without raising an eyebrow. But behind that mild exterior lurked a dream so outrageous it was almost laughable, stealing millions in gold bullion and smuggling it out of Britain. The genius of the plan? Transforming the gold into miniature Eiffel Tower souvenirs and exporting them straight out of London. It was meticulous, absurd, and brilliantly British. Holland wasn't working alone, of course. He teamed up with Stanley Holloway's Pendlebury, a quirky artist who owned a foundry. Together, they assembled a crew of unlikely accomplices and set the stage for one of cinema's most creative heists. Director Charles Crichton and writer T.E.B. Clarke crafted a story where every detail mattered. You weren't watching superheroes or gangsters. You were watching ordinary men who believed they could outsmart a system that had ignored them their whole lives. And for a while, it looked like they might succeed. But as every great caper reminds us, fate has a cruel sense of humor. A slip here, a mistake there, and the whole scheme unraveled with comedic brilliance. The Lavender Hill Mob wasn't just funny, it was groundbreaking. It won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay, earned Guinness International acclaim, and proved that Britain could turn crime into comedy without losing an ounce of tension. More importantly, it set the blueprint. Build a crew, make a plan, let chaos do the rest. If Ocean's 11 was the stylish Vegas version, this was the scrappy original. The Ladykillers, 1955. Now, picture this. A sweet little old lady takes in a group of polite musicians as lodgers. They carry violin cases, play records for cover, and seem perfectly harmless. Except, there's one catch. They're not musicians at all. They're criminals planning a major heist, using her house as a base. That's the twisted brilliance of the Ladykillers, one of the darkest and funniest comedies Britain ever produced. Alec Guinness returned, this time in a very different role. With his crooked teeth, unsettling grin, and sinister charm, he played Professor Marcus, the gang's ringleader. His team of crooks, each more incompetent than the last, included a young Peter Sellers, proving early on that his gift for comedy was unmatched. The setup was delicious. Hardened criminals attempting to orchestrate a flawless heist while living under the roof of Katie Johnson's sweet, devout, and deceptively sharp landlady, Mrs. Wilberforce. The comedy didn't come from elaborate disguises or flashy action. It came from the collision of innocence and criminality. Every time the gang thought they had things under control, misses. Wilberforce's polite meddling exposed another crack in their plan. The crooks weren't undone by police or rival gangs. They were undone by tea, small talk, and an old woman's stubborn decency. Director Alexander McKendrick infused the film with biting satire. Unlike American crime films that glorified ambition, the Ladykillers mocked it. These so-called master criminals were fools in disguise, undone by their arrogance and the sheer absurdity of fate. By the end, the landlady stood triumphant, while the gang crumbled into chaos. The movie remains iconic, not only because of its twisted humor, but because it revealed a truth at the heart of the British caper. Crime might be thrilling, but it's also hopelessly, hilariously doomed. No wonder the Coen brothers tried to remake it decades later. The original, though, remains untouchable. The League of Gentlemen, 1960. If you thought military discipline guaranteed success, The League of Gentlemen proved otherwise. Released just months before Sinatra's Ocean's 11, it told the story of ex-army officers who decide to put their training to a very different use, robbing a bank. The premise was irresistible. War veterans, once celebrated as heroes, now channeling their tactical precision into crime. Led by Jack Hawkins as Colonel Hyde, the disgruntled officers approached robbery the way they once approached combat. Every detail was mapped out like a military campaign. Uniforms replaced with disguises, drills turned into rehearsals, and strategies borrowed straight from the battlefield. On paper, the plan was flawless, but life after war rarely goes to plan, and the comedy came from watching military rigidity collapse under the unpredictable chaos of civilian crime. What made the film so brilliant was its underlying commentary. These men weren't caricatures. They were veterans forgotten by the society they had fought for. Instead of reintegration, they found themselves idle, restless, and broke. Their heist became a satire on post-war Britain, where discipline clashed with disillusionment. Cinematically, The League of Gentlemen was stylish and suspenseful, but it also had a wicked sense of humor. Watching ex-soldiers apply combat logic to bank robbery was both absurd and oddly believable. Hawkins gave the film gravitas, but the supporting cast brought enough humor to make the whole affair feel like a caper rather than a crime drama. More than just a film, it was proof that Britain could take the bones of the American heist formula and twist them into something more ironic, more satirical, and ultimately more human. Instead of Rat Pack cool, we got ex-army grit, and it worked beautifully. A Run for Your Money, 1949. Sometimes, the chase itself is the heist. A Run for Your Money wasn't about bank vaults or gold bullion. Instead, it followed two Welsh brothers traveling to London to collect a newspaper prize. Sounds simple, right? Except the prize money slipped through their fingers almost instantly, launching them into a whirlwind of cons, distractions, and near misses that turned their trip into a full-blown caper. This film captured a different side of British comedy. Instead of polished criminals, it gave us innocent outsiders. The brothers, wide-eyed and naive, were completely out of their depth in post-war London. Their attempts to track down the prize mirrored the structure of a heist comedy. There was a setup, a plan, endless mistakes, and a frantic scramble to fix them. The laughs came not from criminal genius, but from cultural clash. Quiet Welsh charm colliding with the hustle and bustle of the big city. Directed by Charles Friend, the film combined light-hearted humor with sharp observation. London, still scarred by war, became both a playground and an obstacle course. The brothers stumbled into every kind of urban chaos: con artists, miscommunication, and sheer bad luck. While it's often overlooked compared to the more famous Ealing comedies, A Run for Your Money proved that the caper formula wasn't limited to hardened crooks. Anyone chasing something just out of reach, whether loot or prize money, could find themselves swept into the same whirlpool of comedy and disaster. In many ways, it foreshadowed the underdog-driven capers that would later dominate the genre. Hue and Cry, 1947. If one film can claim to have lit the fuse for the British heist comedy, it's Hue and Cry. Released in 1947, it's often called the very first Ealing comedy, and for good reason. The story followed a London boy who discovers his favorite comic book is being used as a code for real-life crimes. Outraged and determined, he rallies a gang of local kids to outsmart the adult crooks. The brilliance of Hue and Cry was its perspective. For once, the heroes weren't detectives or masterminds, they were children. That twist made the film revolutionary. Suddenly, the idea of a caper wasn't just about planning and precision. It was about guts, imagination, and sheer nerve. The crooks, played straight, couldn't believe they were being undone by kids armed with bicycles and comics. The audience, meanwhile, loved every second of it. Director Charles Crichton shot much of the film on the bomb-damaged streets of post-war London, giving it an authentic grit. That realism made the children's antics feel even more daring. The contrast between bleak surroundings and the kids' relentless energy gave the story a pulse that still resonates. Hue and Cry set the tone for decades of British comedy. It showed that underdogs could topple crooks, that laughter could come from the clash between innocence and ambition, and that a well-timed plan falling apart was always comedy gold. Without it, the British caper boom might never have happened. The Criminal, 1960. If you thought British crime films couldn't get darker while still playing for laughs, The Criminal will prove you wrong. Directed by Joseph Losey and starring Stanley Baker, this film straddled the line between prison drama and sly caper comedy. Baker played a hardened inmate plotting the ultimate robbery, and though the atmosphere was bleak, the sheer audacity of the scheme added an ironic edge that kept audiences grinning. The brilliance here lay in tone. Losey, an American exiled to Britain, brought grit to the screen, but Baker's sharp wit and the absurdity of prison life gave it a comic sting. The idea of a heist being organized behind bars felt both daring and ridiculous. How could a man boxed in by walls plan the crime of the century? The answer? With stubborn ingenuity and a sense of humor. The criminal showed audiences that heist comedies didn't need to be lighthearted Ealing affairs. They could be grim, cynical, and still full of ironic laughs. Stanley Baker's performance stood out because he wasn't playing a clown. He was serious, dangerous even, but the universe around him kept pulling his grand vision toward failure. That balance of tension and comedy became a hallmark of British caper cinema. By blending raw toughness with sly wit, the criminal carved out a space between straight crime drama and the caper comedy. It wasn't just about the laughs. It was about watching pride go head-to-head with inevitability, and the audience getting to smirk at every misstep along the way. Two-Way Stretch, 1960. Peter Sellers was at his mischievous best in Two-Way Stretch, a comedy so perfectly absurd it could only have been born in Britain. The plot was deliciously simple. A gang of inmates plot to commit a robbery while still serving time in prison. That's right, they'd slip out, grab the loot, and sneak back into their cells before the guards even noticed they were gone. The setup alone guaranteed laughs. How do you balance digging tunnels, rehearsing disguises, and organizing a getaway when your warden is watching your every move? Sellers, playing the conman Dodger Lane, delivered his trademark blend of charm and slyness, making you almost root for the crooks. His chemistry with co-stars David Lodge and Bernard Cribbins turned the gang into one of cinema's most lovable bands of rogues. But the film's secret weapon was Lionel Jeffries as the new prison governor, Mr. Kraut. His pompous dedication to order clashed hilariously with the inmates' carefully timed plans. Every scene between Sellers and Jeffries crackled with comedy, the straight-laced official unknowingly fueling the farce. Two-Way Stretch was released just months before Ocean's 11, proving Britain had perfected the art of the caper. Slick Americans might have looked stylish in Las Vegas, but here was a crew of bumbling prisoners who outsmarted authority without losing their sense of humor. The result? A comedy that remains one of the most inventive entries in the genre. The Wrong Arm of the Law, 1963. By the early 60s, Peter Sellers was the undisputed king of British comedy, and The Wrong Arm of the Law cemented it. In this caper, Sellers played Pearly Gates, a Cockney crook who ran a high-class fashion boutique as a front for his heists. But the real twist came when his gang faced rivals disguised as policemen, conmen stealing from conmen, with the actual police caught in between. This wasn't just a robbery plot. It was a send-up of authority, crime, and the fine line between order and chaos. Sellers reveled in his role, switching from suave shop owner to exasperated gangster with ease. The supporting cast, Lionel Jeffries, Bernard Cribbins, and Bill Kerr, added layers of farce, turning the whole affair into a comedy of mistaken identities and shifting loyalties. The Wrong Arm of the Law stood out for its sheer creativity. Who else but British filmmakers could turn the classic cops and robbers chase into a triangle where nobody knew who to trust? It wasn't just about outwitting the police, it was about crooks trying to outwit fake police while teaming up with real police. The absurdity was delicious. Critics loved how the movie combined caper mechanics with satirical humor. It wasn't simply a heist, it was a parody of the entire criminal world. And thanks to Sellers' performance, it became a timeless example of how British cinema could take crime, twist it into comedy, and still deliver tension that kept audiences hooked. Too Many Crooks, 1959. Some gangs are slick, others are disasters waiting to happen. Too Many Crooks belongs to the latter, and that's exactly why it's so funny. Terry Thomas starred as Fingers Howard, a criminal whose supposed brilliance is constantly undermined by his hapless crew. Their grand idea? Kidnap a wealthy businessman's daughter. Except in true British comedy fashion, they botch the plan completely and end up with the wrong person. The genius of the film lay in escalation. Every mistake led to a bigger mess, and the gang's inability to control the situation spiraled out of their hands. Terry Thomas, with his trademark gap-toothed grin and faux sophistication, embodied the perfect comic crook, convinced of his genius but doomed by arrogance. The rest of the gang, played by Sid James, George Cole, and Bernard Bresslaw, were equally incompetent, making the ensemble a masterclass in comedic chemistry. Unlike Hollywood's polished con men, these crooks were anything but smooth. They tripped, argued, and constantly turned on each other. But that was the charm. You didn't watch Too Many Crooks to see a perfect plan executed. You watched to see how far it would fall apart. Released in 1959, it bridged the Ealing era with the broader 60s wave of British comedies. It showed that crime could be chaotic, silly, and endlessly entertaining, and it made a strong case for Terry Thomas as one of the greatest comic villains of his generation. Crooks Anonymous, 1962. What happens when crooks try to go straight? In Crooks Anonymous, the answer is chaos. This clever satire imagined a secret organization designed to rehabilitate career criminals through shock therapy and strict discipline. Leslie Phillips starred as a charming thief whose girlfriend demands he give up crime. Desperate, he turns to Crooks Anonymous, only to find that quitting isn't as easy as it sounds. The concept was a stroke of comic brilliance. Imagine Alcoholics Anonymous but for thieves, complete with stern mentors, group sessions, and endless tests of willpower. The humor came from watching crooks struggle to resist temptation, only to relapse in spectacular fashion. Every attempt to reform Phillips's character ended in failure, usually with him back in the middle of another botched scheme. Crooks Anonymous wasn't just about laughs. It tapped into the early 60s fascination with psychology and rehabilitation, mocking the idea that bad habits could be cured with enough discipline. The film poked fun at both criminals and the institutions trying to change them, creating a balanced satire that never felt mean-spirited. With its playful premise and sharp performances, Crooks Anonymous stood apart from traditional heist comedies. It wasn't about pulling off the perfect robbery, it was about resisting one, and failing hilariously every time. In the process, it carved out its own niche in the history of British capers. The Big Job, 1965. Timing is everything in a caper, and the big job plays with that idea until it hurts. The film followed a gang of crooks who bury their stolen loot in a tree, planning to retrieve it after serving a long prison sentence. 18 years later, they're free, ready to collect their treasure, only to discover their old hiding spot is now part of a police station. Cue the chaos. Sid James, Joan Sims, and Dick Emery brought the story to life with impeccable comedic timing. Watching the gang tiptoe around law enforcement while desperately trying to reclaim their buried stash was a masterclass in farce. Every near discovery, every panicked cover-up, and every failed scheme pushed the gang further into absurdity. The Big Job wasn't just funny, it was a satire on time itself. The world the crooks thought they'd return to had changed completely. Their clever plan, once foolproof, had become laughably impossible. That gap between past confidence and present reality gave the film its comic punch. It also showed how British heist comedies had evolved. By the mid-60s, the genre wasn't just about pulling off crimes. It was about poking fun at the futility of long-term schemes. No matter how carefully you plan, life, and in this case the police, always gets in the way. Light Up the Sky, 1960, War. Might seem like an odd backdrop for comedy, but Light Up the Sky proved otherwise. Set during World War II, it followed a group of British soldiers stationed at an anti-aircraft site. Instead of focusing on combat, the story zoomed in on their harebrained schemes to escape boredom, black market deals, petty cons, and small-time hustles. The humor came not from battles, but from the soldiers' restless need to outsmart authority and bend rules. These weren't villains. They were ordinary men, craving excitement in a monotonous environment. Their antics, from trading supplies to sneaking out, carried the same DNA as the caper comedy: plans, improvisations, and inevitable collapses. Directed by Lewis Gilbert, who later helmed Bond films, Light Up the Sky highlighted how close comedy and crime could be. Strip away the uniforms, and the soldiers were no different from the crooks in Ealing Studios' classics, dreaming big, bungling bigger, and leaving audiences laughing at their hopeless schemes. The film's legacy lies in showing how the caper format wasn't limited to thieves. Any group with too much time, too much imagination, and too little sense could end up plotting something that spiraled out of control. And in Britain, that was always funny. Make Mine Mink, 1960. not all masterminds are slick young rebels. In Make Mine Mink, the crooks were elderly lodgers and a retired major who decide to spice up their lives by stealing mink coats. That's right, pensioners pulling off fashion heists. The setup alone was pure comedy gold. Led by Alastair Sim, one of Britain's greatest comic actors, the gang pulled off their schemes with a mix of military precision and doddering incompetence. The joy of the film came from watching respectable seniors break every social rule in the book. Their age didn't hold them back. It gave them the perfect disguise. Who would ever suspect a group of kindly old folks of daring robberies? The charm of Make Mine Mink was that it flipped expectations. Instead of young crooks rebelling against authority, you had retirees rebelling against boredom. Their crimes weren't mean-spirited. They were mischievous, almost playful, and in true caper fashion, the more they succeeded, the more tangled their escapades became. The movie became a cult hit, beloved for its quirky tone and its message that adventure doesn't have an age limit. It cemented Alastair Sim's reputation as a genius of British comedy and proved that the caper genre could reinvent itself in endlessly surprising ways. The Green Man, 1956. Sometimes the funniest heists aren't about money at all. The Green Man, starring Alastair Sim, centered on a professional assassin whose plans are constantly thwarted by nosy neighbors, mistaken identities, and one ridiculous interruption after another. While technically more of an assassination comedy, it shared the same DNA as the classic caper, elaborate plans undone by chaos. Sim played Hawkins, a meticulous planner whose calm exterior hid endless frustration. Every time he tried to carry out his plot, ordinary people got in the way: door-to-door salesmen, oblivious couples, and bumbling locals. The brilliance lay in watching precision crumble under the weight of sheer bad luck. Though darker than many Ealing comedies, The Green Man thrived on irony. It asked the question, how can someone so careful be so constantly undone by chance? That mix of menace and humor made it unforgettable. The Green Man proved that the caper formula could stretch beyond robberies. At its core, the genre was about plans, timing, and the delicious comedy that arises when everything falls apart. And, in Sim's capable hands, even failure became a triumph of laughter. The Maggie, 1954. At first glance, The Maggie doesn't look like a heist comedy. There's no bank, no gold, no jewels. But, make no mistake, it's a caper through and through. The story followed a wily Scottish boat captain and his ragtag crew who trick an American businessman into letting them transport valuable cargo. What unfolds is less about theft and more about con artistry, but the spirit is pure heist. The captain, played by Alex Mackenzie, wasn't a slick operator. He was stubborn, proud, and endlessly inventive. Every obstacle, whether rival ships, official inspections, or the businessman himself, was met with another outrageous scheme. The comedy came from the crew's sheer determination to keep the con alive, no matter how unlikely their success seemed. The Maggie captured the essence of British capers: underdogs bending rules, conning authority, and somehow staying one step ahead. It wasn't glamorous, but it was authentic. And in many ways, it foreshadowed the lovable rogues who would later define the genre. More than just a comedy, the film celebrated resilience, wit, and the joy of beating the odds. For audiences in the 50s, still recovering from post-war struggles, that message hit home. It was proof that, sometimes, the smallest boat can outmaneuver the biggest ship. So, there you have it, 15 British heist comedies that shaped the very idea of the caper, long before Ocean's 11 swaggered into Las Vegas. These films weren't about glamour or perfection. They were about ordinary people, flawed schemes, and the hilarious collapse of foolproof plans. Which of these do you think deserves a modern remake? Share your thoughts, hit subscribe, and let's keep celebrating the wild, witty world of cinema's most unlikely masterminds. After all, who doesn't love a plan gone wrong?